So welcome back to Rebalancing Money. It's wonderful to have the second in what will hopefully be an extended series of these discussions with different people from all around the world, different perspectives, backgrounds, beliefs, conditions, experiences, all of it. And today, I'm really, really happy to welcome a very dear friend of mine. And as such, it feels kind of strange for me to do the general introduction thing because Faz is truly a heart, a heart friend of mine. But in brief, Farzam comes out of the banking industry in South Africa, where he led innovation at one of the big banks in the country here. And they built an entire exchange in the bank. Which was never released, unfortunately, but which he was brave enough to take into his work on what has become Valor, the most successful exchange in South Africa, which is indeed growing around the world and which has proved not only resilient, but considerably beautiful from a user experience perspective through some of the recent turmoil in the market. And given this rich professional experience coupled with a deep humanism and a perspective on wealth and relationship, which I have very rarely encountered in my life, I couldn't think of anybody better to have a discussion with about what money is, how we might think about balancing its link to faith. The links between faith and finance are strong and often returned to in the kernel syllabus. And it will be a large part of what we talk about today. But prior to doing that, Faz, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's so lovely to have you. And please feel free to fill in anything that I might have missed prior to us.
Oh, thank you very much. No, you've been very generous. I'm very, very excited to be here. And obviously, before we get going, I'd love to, if possible, just to hear a little bit about who's on the call and kind of, without taking too much of our time, just kind of, who's here.
Vivek, perhaps you would be willing to do a little round quickly from Houston. So nice.
Sure. Farzam, it's so great to be with you today. In the room, we have 11 people, of which everyone has spent some time with us in Kernel, which is an 8-week peer learning community. If I look around the room, I see people with backgrounds in history, in finance, in technology. I see writers, user designers, user experience designers, and people working in all sorts of industries beyond Web3. You see Harper here, just working on handicrafts and kind of like thinking about communal spaces and how Web3 and money might fit into them well. Maybe it would be the way I might describe it.
And just one more.
And we're all over the world, is that correct?
We're all over the world, literally most continents represented except perhaps Australia.
Okay.
Doesn't even count. Doesn't even big island. And I would also like to invite, I'm not going to invite everybody to some feedback. But I would love to also just hear from Susan, because Susan was really the genesis of these conversations. And I think if Susan, just to expand on what Vivek has been trying to highlight there, of the manner in which our interests overflow from the purely technical, if you would be willing to say just a few words about gifts and gift giving and the background that you have in that, because I think a lot of us are very interested in that, and it will also inform our conversation today, and it would be fascinating to have that note at the beginning.
Thanks, Andy. You know, gifting has become integral to my work, as is economics. I basically spent a very large fortune trying to bring something called sacred economics and philanthropic commerce to market, and it fantastically failed. To which I am recovering through understanding of a gifting economy. What is it that is the gift of failure and the gift of friendship and the gifts that we have beyond price that can't be named, that can't be measured. And to me, money to be no less important than anything as the embodiment of gift and how it is perceived. Is it a thing? Is it energy? Is it the whole concept of what is a gift is a course that is a conversation that I host as I nomadically travel around the country. And what I find is that this particular group out of Kernel is an anomaly, that I'm quite old at this point, and my peer group simply does not get the concept of gift beyond price. And I think that is the responsibility and the opportunity for this group to educate us and the rest of the world on that. So is that enough, Andy?
That's perfect. Thank you so much. That's lovely. I can hear the story forever, honestly. We'll just have you back in another full hour next time. But thank you so much for setting that context. And I love being called an anomaly. I think that's a wonderful description of so many people in the room. So it's truly such a compliment, and it's such a joy to.
Well, and so needed. Oh, the world is hungry and desperate for this anomaly.
Exactly. Okay, so I have placed in the chat an old article from the Universal House of Justice, which is the seat of the Baha'i government in the world. And the reason I've done so is that Farzam is a member of the worldwide Baha'i community, and it will inform a great deal of our discussion today, having premised this with the notion that faith and finance are intimately linked. And in fact, they're intimately linked because they come out of a place where, not far from Baha'i and Baha'u'llah, right? The ancient Sumerian clay tablets are basically in his neck of the woods. So I love this particular resonance, and I want to use it to kind of ground our conversation today. Before I touch into exact questions about this text and how it might help us think about money in truly balanced, just, and generous ways, Farzam, I'd love just to hear first a little bit of your perspective on the current macroeconomic conditions, the problems with banks, both in America, Switzerland, and perhaps elsewhere around the world. And just before we go into kind of justice, knowledge, commonwealth, let's ground ourselves a little bit in what the hell is going on right now in this moment. How are you feeling as somebody who runs a business, who has salaries to pay, who is very concerned with the ordinary practical justice of doing good by the people that you work with, of making sure that your role as provider is sufficiently fulfilled? And if we can take the macroeconomic conditions, talk about your business, and then move into some of the questions that I have in a more abstract sense.
Sure. So in short, everything is fine. Next question. Just checking.
Everything is perfect. The answer is love.
So everybody is no doubt aware of kind of the headlines in the news and what's going on with, last week or the last couple of weeks in the US with the three failed banks, and obviously with Credit Suisse being acquired by or taken over by UBS, and central bankers around the world opening up swap lines with the Federal Reserve to ensure there's enough, US dollar liquidity. And I think it might be worth going to some technical level of what's going on, not too deep because we could spend the entire time doing that. But obviously, and I need to be quite nuanced here because it's very easy, and especially for those of you on Twitter and other places, people are very easy to fall into just one camp, and then they attack the other side, and then they defend their own side. And life is much more nuanced than that. right? And so, I ask myself, for example, what I would be doing as a central banker. And the response is I would be doing exactly what the central bankers are doing. I think that within the mandate and within the kind of tools that they have, they're actually doing everything that they can be doing. They're trying to provide confidence to the market. They're trying to ease any uncertainties. They're trying to make sure that everybody kind of just gets back to life and doesn't have to worry about the financial system. The fact of the matter is that our financial system is very worrying, and that it is on very shaky territory. It always has been, and I think we're moving into realms where we're hoping we can make it a little bit better. But also there's a fallacy to think that everybody getting into Web3 and crypto and Bitcoin, etc. That's the way that the world is going to be saved. It's not that simple, right? So, in short, obviously with the rise in interest rates, everybody probably knows that banks sort of take deposits and then they lend out those deposits, and sometimes they don't lend out those deposits, but they actually buy assets on the other side of the balance sheet. And in short, those assets, which are meant to be safe, and they were probably safe from the perspective of if you take counterparty risk to the US government and some of the institutions within the US, they would be safe generally if they were held to maturity. But with the increase of interest rates, those values have come down, and therefore lack of confidence in some of our banks, people drawing those funds out, have caused people to sell those assets at a loss and therefore becoming insolvent, right? Whereas if they were able to hold on to those assets till maturity, they probably wouldn't have seen this. But banks have to manage liquidity, and they also have to manage capital. And in this case, liquidity concerns have affected their capital positions and therefore have become insolvent. So I think that's all I'll say right now, except to say that I think this is the very beginning of things. I don't think that we're, thank God that's over, and okay, that the central banks have come to our rescue. I think there's a lot to talk about in this conversation about that very topic. But I think the instability that we have, I think, is just at the very beginning.
So I think that's a fascinating introduction. And I had to mute you, sorry, just because of the feedback. But please unmute.
No, I'll say no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
That's fine. To the start. The of course the follow up here, right? And I don't want to have an only macroeconomic conversation about these things. But the natural follow up is, well, whose responsibility is it to mark these bonds to market when interest rates rise, their value goes down, and depositors are withdrawing, so you have to sell them, right? Like it's ultimately the discretion of the people who keep the books, right? Like whether you mark the bonds to market or whether you say, oh no, we're holding these till maturity, like don't look over here, we're all good. And this is perhaps one of the problems of the financial system, one of the reasons why it's worrying. But and this is one of the points that we have always resonated on, and one of the reasons that I think that you're such a nuanced and wonderful individual, is that everybody joining Bitcoin and Web3 is not the silver bullet, it's not the solution. And I wonder if we can just spend a little bit more time thinking through this, because, when you're no longer in one of these Twitter camps slinging mud at the other side and trying to defend your own position, you begin to realize that if we don't have the discretion to mark our bonds to market when we think that it's the correct time to do so, and to make have some kind of flexibility over the way in which value is represented in the systems that we use to transact, then we inevitably end up in this very autonomous and inflexible place of like a maker vault, where you just get a 13% penalty if you get margin called, and there's no recourse. You can't call your bank and be like, no, I'll pay the margin tomorrow, I promise, here's some other. It's a smart contract and it's a 13% penalty, and that's it. And there's very good reasons to think that kind of autonomous predictability, which is inflexible, is really good in the face of a complex system, because central bankers, as you say, no matter how good they are, no matter what kind of intention they have, simply do not, none of us do. They do not have the tools to understand and model entirely complex systems by definition, because complex systems, small changes in the input, large changes in the output, can't be predicted. And yet, on the other side, you've got people saying, well, if the Fed wasn't there with the big printer, we would all be suffering enormously right now, because when this kind of cycle gets going and there's this loss of confidence or belief, what can stop that other than other human beings, right? Like, it's certainly not an autonomous mechanism that's going to execute exactly what it's coded to execute when the conditions for that code are met. So I'm really fascinated if you could expand just a little bit more on, like, where do you find the line? How do you tread that knife edge between flexibility, human response, responsibility in the very human sense, and predictability, autonomy, the notion that the only true and credibly neutral response to a complex system is to encode rules in a public and verifiable manner that everybody can see, and therefore the publicity and the verification associated with it is what keeps belief within the bounds that we need for the system to function. How do you have it?
Thanks. So there's a lot in there. I think I'll just, because of time, we don't have too much time, I think I'll just jump straight into a whole bunch of kind of thoughts and ideas, and then I'm very, very happy to kind of be challenged on them or get your thoughts on them, etc. We have about how long do we have, Andy?
We have another 40 minutes.
Okay, cool. So I just want to read a paragraph from that the article or the letter that Andy said. You don't actually have to refer to it. I'll just read it. It's just a few sentences long, but I think it will kind of base a bunch of our discussions from at least the vantage point that I'm coming from. So it says, referring to the exigencies of the material world, Baha'u'llah, the author of the Baha'i Revelation, has affirmed that to every end has been assigned a means for its accomplishment. A natural conclusion to be drawn from reflection on this fundamental principle is that vigilance must be exercised in distinguishing means from ends. Otherwise, what is intended as a mere instrument could easily become the very goal of an individual's life. The acquisition of wealth is a case in point. It is acceptable and praiseworthy. So wealth is acceptable and praiseworthy to the extent that it serves as a means for achieving higher ends, for meeting one's basic necessities, for fostering the progress of one's family, for promoting the welfare of society, and for contributing to the establishment of a world civilization. But to make the accumulation of wealth the central purpose of one's life is unworthy of any human being. And I'll read that last statement again. But to make the accumulation of wealth the central purpose of one's life is unworthy of any human being. Okay, this paragraph really, it means a lot to me, and it's really at the core of kind of how I try to live life, and also the core of some of the thoughts that I have on this topic. And the reason is it's quite far from everything society stands for, right? In society, we have lists, right? Who's the top person in the world? Like, we praise these people that have been able to accumulate, during the course of their lives, the biggest balance, the biggest amount of points of society that we have, which are, in many ways just fictitious entries into now ledgers and databases that are electronic. You can't even see them. But it's almost like a game that, we revere the people on the rich lists, right? And so much so that, people's aspirations are to become as wealthy as possible, get into whatever line of work that can, give them the highest pay or the biggest chance to a big bank account and a big NAV, right? A net asset value. So the reason I bring this up is I think that the world is completely off tilt. right? And in fact, whether we talk about being off tilt in dollars or in Bitcoin, you come down to exactly the same outcome, right? So let's say that the dollar does fail, right? And by the way, side topic, which is not such a side topic, but I do think that in my lifetime that we won't have the dollar, but I think the dollar will fail in dramatic fashion during my lifetime over the next few decades. I know there's currently, for those that are following, a bet about whether it will fail in the next 3 months, which I don't think is very likely. But I think that if you read history, the dollar not failing would be completely improbable when you look at what history tells us about the history of money and the nature of a reserve currency time and time again in our history books, right? But I think the challenge is when we talk also about trust, and I want to bring this word trust into our discussion because, especially in Web3, we're talking about, trustlessness and, verify, don't trust. And, and I'm actually going to probably release a little, little thread on Twitter just about this topic about trust, which I think is very, very misdirected and misguided. Because as a social species, we live and thrive when trust is established. And we actually bear the brunt and the costs when trust is breached. But to try to reach for a society where we don't need to trust any other human being, that is a very, very sad state of affairs for the world, right? Like on a day-to-day basis, you can't eat at a restaurant because you don't trust what they're putting in the food. You can't get onto the highways because you don't trust people will actually follow the rules and not crash your car, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So this idea of trust, I think we actually need to get back to what trustworthiness is rather than try to get rid of trust altogether. And the reason that affects our financial system is I think, the concept of money has always been based on trust. It's always been based on belief. It never has been intrinsic. The idea of intrinsic value doesn't exist, right? Intrinsic, it's always in the kind of eye of the beholder, right? And so my philosophy and my thinking about this topic is that actually we're going to have to find spiritual solutions to economic problems. Now that sounds very airy-fairy and like, what are you talking about? Like, what's the interest rate going to be and all that kind of stuff. But I think we're realizing more and more that regardless of what any central bank does right now, and let's go to Zimbabwe actually, which is quite close to where Andy and I lived, right? Despite the best efforts of the Zimbabwean authorities to shore up confidence in their currency, the Zimbabwean dollar, just over a decade and a half ago, it hyperinflated into non-existence, right? So much so that the very dollar, the Zimbabwean dollar that country was trying to defend and trying to make sure that people believed it had value, they wouldn't even accept that same dollar as a means of settlement for their taxes, right? For people to settle their taxes, they said, no, we're not even going to accept that dollar anymore ourselves because it's worthless, right? So the very people that were meant to instill confidence into that asset were the very people that stopped accepting that asset because confidence had fallen away. And it was the confidence of the populace, or the lack thereof, the lack of confidence of the populace, that brought about that eventual result. So effectively, regardless of what the Fed, the ECB, or all the central banks do around the world, they cannot instill confidence and trust into people. That's a societal concept. That's a concept that all of us kind of need to buy into that story. And if we do, great. If we don't, then we have a lot of volatility, and we'll see what happens there. But it also needs to be based on some fundamental economic principles. Cheers. Bye, Richard. So I think so long as our system, and this is going to be a generational journey, which I think that we've already made a huge advances in social kind of principles in society. If you look at things like race or the status of women in society, etc., these are generational, like in our just the last few generations, right? Women have been able to vote, never been able to do that for millennia, right? In most parts of the world, right? And same thing with race and stuff like that that's coming to the fore now. I think this idea that we need to change our outlook on how we view our lives, which is, it's not just about me and you know, me kind of taking everything I can get, and regardless of what everybody else is doing. I think we also need to see ourselves as protagonists in a societal narrative, and that we have responsibility towards that societal narrative. And I think we will continue to kind of suffer these crises so long as that doesn't change. Let me pause there. I've said quite a bit, but I think the main thing is that we need a complete paradigm reset, which is not reset from the dollar to the Bitcoin or to Bitcoin, but is a complete paradigm reset as to how do we think of our society? How do we think about our personal responsibilities and obligations to society that we live in? Because society is not just out there. Society, we are part of that society. We contribute to that society. Without us, society would not exist. And then what does trust look like in that society? And then what is then a financial system that is based on trust look like in that society? And unfortunately, these get very philosophical, but I think we need to start from there, because otherwise you just propagate the current system that you have with all its deficiencies. And I think a forum like this is nice to step back and kind of ask some of those fundamental questions.
Perfect. Yeah, I love that response because it leads me into all of the questions that I have about this particular piece. And I want to try and excavate with you what spiritual principles actually have application to economics, right? Because as you say, when one says that, it can sound fairly abstract and a little bit airy-fairy, but it's right there in the language is the point that we make in Kernel, right? We have a whole piece about trust, and we make the point that confidence comes from the Latin confidere, fidere meaning trust, right? It's with trust. It's all about trust. Trust itself is not only veritas, right? It's not only the ability to verify, it's triova, it's stability, reliability, this sense of something shared. And it's in that, right, that notion of something shared, where I see the greatest convergence between spiritual principles and economic ones. Because we have economic tools, language, and symbols for talking about that which we share. Not many of them. We're not great at talking about club goods and public goods and commonwealth, but we have some stuff there, and certainly a history of them. And then that which we share and how it is shared seems to be at the heart of many different religious traditions around the world. So I want to kind of focus us in on that as perhaps a means of beginning to explore together what specific principles and what kind of application in different contexts, what does unity in diversity really look like when we're thinking about shared stuff? Because this article in particular has like a few, it says, see your own welfare as inseparable from the welfare of others. And one of the ways that we define public goods is public goods are those things in which the benefit of others is axiomatic. Excludable, non-rivalrous, blah, 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 cool, we can do the economic dance, but the benefit of others is axiomatic. It is the thing upon which all else is founded. And in that, one gets to this notion of service to others, seeing others' welfare as inseparable from ourselves. And I wonder if you might care to kind of comment on that and its application to, you know, where that convergence between spiritual principles and economic practice and pragmatism really is.
Perfect. You
muted again. Sorry, Faz.
There you go. I'll trust if I'm not saying something right, then I need to change tack because you keep muting me, right? No. So the message that I've just put in the chat for those that are interested is not such a long message, but it actually goes into some of the questions that you've just posed, and it's to the Baha'i community worldwide, asking them to think about and apply their mind about the topic that we're talking about, how to actually put that into practice in their daily lives, right? So I think, where does this come together? So I think, first of all, let's start off with just a some of you guys may know about this thought experiment, but I think it helps kind of frame this topic again, which is, let's say we had to throw all of our lives into a pot, okay, into a bag. Everybody's life, everybody that's alive today in the world, if we could take their life and put it into a bag, and including our own lives, we chuck it into that bag and we kind of mix it all up, okay? And then we have to put our hand in without looking and to pick a life that would be our own, right? From all the whatever 8 billion lives that there are out there. The question is, would we proceed by picking that life now? Or would we make, first of all, changes to our system, our economic system, before we pick that life, right? And without opening it up to discussion, invariably, the response that you get from everybody is to say, no, 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 no. The chances of me getting a life that's anywhere near dignified, right, and comfortable is so limited that let me make a few changes to our system before I pick that life, right? And that kind of comes back to the core of what we're talking about, is like, okay, well, then what changes would we want to see to make such that we would be more comfortable picking a life for ourselves? Because right now, most people are not comfortable doing that. And I think some of these notions and principles that we talk about one is justice, right? I think we will not be able to have peace in the world, literal peace, and also peace in financial markets and things like that, without the notion of justice. And what does justice mean? We could spend an entire, it depends on where the person you're asking is located. Absolutely. I'm saying globally, though. If you say globally, you put everybody's lives globally into that basket, right? Location Earth, then what does it look like, right? So I think with let me pause there. Did someone come off mute? Someone want to say something? Feel free to interrupt, by the way.
No, sorry. What I meant was, sorry, I also have a little bit of an echo. It's, if you ask a person that is currently located, let's say, in the western part of the northern hemisphere, they will not choose this. But if you pick somebody from the rest of the 90% of the world,
oh, absolutely, good point.
Answer.
Yeah, 100%. Great point. So I should have stipulated the people on this call, but it's a very, very good point, Boyan, because most people would have probably said, yeah, I'll take my chances, because right now things are not as good as they could be. All right. So so I think justice is one of them, right? The other thing that I think, and it sounds again odd, but coming from South Africa, or having spent the last decade and a half, and Andy will be able to attest to this, where you start to see things going completely wildly kind of out of kilter when it comes to the distribution of resources in society, you start to see some very, very ugly outcomes, right? Particularly violent crime, right? Let alone all the humanitarian stuff. And so, I think this idea of, we have camps, okay, we should have a capitalistic system, or communism, or socialism, etc. And I think we can be open to the fact that maybe there's new systems that have not been defined in the past that we need to move towards, because I think any system that we've looked at to date hasn't been very successful, right? From a global perspective, right? In some respects, absolutely. People kind of point to the fact that, okay, economic growth is so much, and we've lifted X amount of people out of poverty, and yes, absolutely, there's been progress in many respects, but there've also been a lot of declines. I think mental illness is probably at an all-time high right now. I don't have the stats for it, but we have a lot of other problems that we're dealing with. So I think justice is a big one. I think the elimination of the extremes of wealth and poverty. And not for one moment do I think everybody should have exactly the same amount. I think there should be some type of meritocracy, and that people should be able to, and I think human nature lends itself to that, where there is incentives, and incentives lend themselves to people behaving differently. But I think the idea, and Andy, you put it, you quoted something about looking at other people's well-beings as well. We've unfortunately in the West become very individualistic, right? And what that individualism has sometimes led to is to kind of put the individual's needs at the height of everything else, including society. But oftentimes we need to say, well, actually, our individual needs are best met when society's needs are met, right? And our economic system is one case in point, right? Like we can try to maximize what we need to do, but let's say the dollar does fail. That scenario is not good for anybody, including people that are in Web3, including people that have Bitcoin, et cetera. That would be a disaster for everybody, right? And it would be a very big crisis to deal with. So I think we still need to define what it is, but I think we need to have the humility to kind of work together as a society, to not to keep slinging, you know, or shooting bullets to people in the other camp, but I actually in a as best as we can in a unified way, to come together, to put our egos aside and to try to understand what is the way forward. I mean, this is very philosophical right now, but I think I unfortunately think that we're going to hit some major crises before humanity wakes up to say, okay, actually, we need to do things fundamentally different to what we're currently doing right now.
So the trend toward philosophical is a perennial danger of answering questions posed by me. I'll take that one on board. But I do want to, like, before asking another philosophical question, just push you on a practical note, which is that given that you have this nuanced perspective, that you recognize that perhaps there are new systems waiting in the adjacent possible elements of which we can pull into our reality now by being conscious of what is just, by being aware that there's no separation, by recognizing that justice is to see me as you, right? All lives, one bag, same thing, right? That there's something deeply just about the recognition of one's own light in another and vice versa. That's all wonderful. How does it find form and expression in running a cryptocurrency exchange? Like, do you have a series of steps? Basically, I'm asking you for your master plan, right? Like, first we what is the link?
Sure. So, I mean, and thanks for that question, because that kind of brings us back down to reality, right? So the fact of the matter is that, you know, one needs to survive, right? And as a business, what does that mean? You've got to have, you know, money that's coming in more than money that's going out. And even if the money that's going out is higher than the money that's coming in, you need to manage your runway and make sure that you have a plan in place, right? So within that journey and within that, you know, kind of looking at your financial statements and looking at, you know, your fundraising activities, I think one of the things, what it does for us at least, is that we have our bearings straight from the perspective of what we will and what we won't do. And this at the very kind of most basic level is just don't do what FTX seems to have done, right? Like, don't dip your hand in the jar that you shouldn't be touching, right? So that's at the most basic level, which is there are certain, let me put it this way, there's certain things or certain limits beyond which you wouldn't go, regardless of what the situation is. So we have a lot of discussions at Valor, for example, to say customer funds are customer funds. If we ever got into a situation where we had difficulties, difficulties financially, which luckily we don't, because we're very blessed and we're very grateful for where we are right now. But if ever that push came to shove, what we would have to do is to say, listen, we're closing down operations, but every single customer can withdraw 100% of their funds, right? So from a philosophical perspective, I think everybody needs to kind of know what their values are, what their lines are that they won't cross. And then also in the way we actually do business in Africa, for example, and other places, is we're very open about what we do, what our business is, that we're in crypto and we're in exchange, and are we welcome to operate in your country or not? Some of our competitors, they will go and kind of disguise themselves as a digital platform that is perfectly fine, or e-commerce or whatever it is, and then they'll be able to open up a bank account where we're not able to open a bank account, and then they're playing cat and mouse with the regulators and the bankers, because once they get found out, then their banks will get closed. They try to open another bank, etc. Right? So our style is actually not to do that, but actually be very open, very transparent in what we do. If we're not welcome, then we're not welcome, and we don't go there. But what it does do, it builds a lot of the trust with those people that we do operate with, to say, okay, these guys are not trying to hide anything. They're very upfront about what they do, whether we agree with them or not. That's what their story is, and that helps us kind of create those bonds of trust with bankers, with customers, with regulators, etc., so that we can operate in an environment that requires trust across all of these different parties to have a business run and function, including our employees. Right? We're very open with our employees. Every employee also has equity, which we make a big deal out of, whether they're a permanent or a non-permanent. If they have some kind of at least a year with Valor, we make sure that everybody has some equity in Valor, so that we're all in the same boat. And then we speak a lot about what are we doing, and is this serving humanity? Is this serving our customer base, right? If it's not serving people, then we shouldn't be doing it, right? We also feel very comfortable saying, listen, we need to survive, we need to pay our bills. And so we're very comfortable telling customers, actually, we can't cut that cost right now, because otherwise then we'd have to start compromising on security and things of that nature, which would not be in your best interest. And so these are our fees, and we're actually, we can't really budge on that, right? So I think the main point is just to kind of know what your values are, what you would sacrifice and what you wouldn't sacrifice, and then do your very best. And I think, you talked about this secret sauce, and I will be the first to admit that we've been very lucky at Valor on multiple dimensions, and I think we're trying things out. What our future is, who knows? And I think that we've got to where we are right now with a huge dose of good luck, as well as making some correct decisions. But I think oftentimes founders are too quick to aspire kind of success to themselves and bad luck to the market. And I think, or external factors. And I think external factors also contribute a huge deal to the good luck that people have. So yeah, I hope that helps a little bit, which is just knowing what you will and what you won't do before the crisis comes, by the way. And this is maybe just a little bit of an aside, but so some of you may or may not know, but Sam Bankman-Fried was and Alameda was an investor into Valor. So never spoke to him specifically, but spoke to their team. And my feeling is that I don't think that team started off their journey trying to defraud the world. But I think that they got into some difficult times where they said, oof, okay, well, Alameda's not doing so well. Can we plug a hole very quickly, and then we'll put the money back? And I think that they weren't prepared for that kind of values judgment at that point in time, and they made the wrong call, and then things started, unwinding very, very, very quickly, right? So I think one always needs to say, okay, if you're in that situation now, what would you do? And make sure you never compromise that position ever. Otherwise, you're going to get into severe problems down the line.
Incredible. The outcome often of speaking with you and going through some of these topics, for me especially, is the recognition that things are always just more simple than we think they are and want them to be. And that second point is really, when we're talking about like a new kind of economic system, one that learns some of the lessons from capitalism, from communism, from socialism, merges them, or comes up with something new, some utterly different paradigm that might truly be just and enact meritocracy across the world in a way that is equitable, if not necessarily equal. It sounds like it has to be so complex. You need 10 different econometric papers and 3 PhDs and just a whole bunch of stuff. And the fact that it comes down to know what your values are, be clear about them, be intentional, set out with service in mind. The fact that it could be that simple is almost too difficult to believe and confrontational in some way. People are like, no, you're naive, you must be wrong. And consistently in our conversations, I come back to the same recognition of the utter simplicity. And sure, there's extraneous circumstances and other conditions outside of your own control, but just the clarity and simplicity that you bring and embody, and I think that a few others might hope to emulate, would already land us in a place far more beneficial to others, which is really the whole point of public goods, of service, of gift giving, of learning. And this is kind of the final point from the article that I wanted to touch on before we opened up to questions from everybody else, which is the quote reads, "The relative prosperity enjoyed by the Baha'is of Iran in the past can be attributed to a culture that lays great emphasis on education and learning, and which recognizes as an act of worship the assiduous and honest pursuit of a useful trade or profession undertaken in the spirit of service." It's an act of worship, Is economics and spirituality not different, right? Faith and finance, not different. It's assiduous and it's honest. There is a profession, there's a skill being developed, but it's not for oneself, it's as a means of greater service, right? So these are not complicated ideals. One doesn't need a whole new ism to, capture it neatly and be like, go to the the great capitalists of the world and say, here's another system that we can misunderstand and which we can allow to inflate our own sense of capacity and hubris. So I wonder, have you thought a lot about, man, is it really just this simple? And if I keep doing the simple thing, will the luck keep coming?
Can I just say something about that, which is, I think it is quite simple from that perspective about just, where you're headed, but that doesn't mean that you will be successful from the way the world currently views success, right? I have no idea what the fate of Valor will be in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, if it will still be around. We don't know. But I think it also kind of comes back to what is your concept of success, and what are you trying to do with your lives? Because I think my belief is at least we live in an integrated life. Your life is not just your work or your personal life or your marriage or your relationships or your charitable givings. It's one, and our days are numbered on earth. And so the question is, if you optimize for financial success of your startup at all costs, then you start giving, by definition, any model that optimizes for one thing will start compromising on everything else, such that one thing does get optimized. And I think that's the problem with our world right now, is that everybody is optimizing for return, financial return, etc. And guess what? One of the things that gets optimized or gets compromised is values, right? We're seeing a lot more corruption that we're around the world right now. We're seeing a lot of kind of things that shouldn't be happening, or lack of integrity that is being kind of sacrificed for this aspiration of economic return. I think that needs to change, and I think it is changing already, right? I mean, over the past 30 years, we've moved further away from just pure shareholder returns to stakeholder returns and looking, triple bottom line and this and that. I think a lot of this is still kind of lip service, but there are big changes that are taking place in the world about the role of business, the role of money, etc. So just wanted to clarify that there's no, it's not I'm not optimizing for Valor success. I am personally optimizing for the most that I can do in my life. Valor seems to be one channel that I can express myself in. but I'm trying to optimize what I can give to the world in the few days that I have remaining on this earth. So yeah. Should we open up to a few questions or thoughts, or please, and please feel free to kind of refute everything that I've said, or like say, you too, like that's, it will only be helpful if you actually bring your full thoughts to the table.
I can say something. I've always loved business. I've loved business since I was too little to really know what business is like. And I, in a funny way, I've always been fascinated by money. But where I diverge from a lot of my peers is wrapping that system of exchanges around values. I actually love advertising because I think advertising is a very efficient way to educate people and motivate them, but it's not tied to personal values or other people's welfare. So I think that the mechanics of business in terms of its ability to quickly interpret what customer success looks like and spin on a dime and try to get better at it, it's a pretty neat skill. But it's done in pursuit of competition and exclusion of the other and dominance. But when you can take the dynamics of exchange and marry them with some sort of common held narrative, I loved your term, social narrative, the stories we tell about ourselves, then we can take the mechanisms of tech or commerce or market economy versus gift economy and blend them in some way. We can't always spend our life being philosophers if we still need to cook dinner for the kids. At some point, we've got to break the egg and, put dinner on the table. But I think that to throw out business and all the tools of its efficiencies and connections, value chains and customers and all that kind of stuff, if we look at business as a world in which exchanges, should they be wrapped around values, can happen, I think we could do some really fun stuff. And I think that that's part of the promise of the Web3 world.
Thank you. See if there are any other comments or complaints or any thoughts. We can also
all I can hear is beeping.
Yeah, someone wanted to start the rave party, I think.
It's just some German punk coming from somewhere.
Yeah.
If you type your question, we'll read it.
Andy, what did you say there? Sorry, I missed that.
We'll get Salim to type his question out, just because there seems to be some German funk going on with his microphone at the moment. There's a little bit of commentary on OpenAI's capped profit model. And Riku, I see you're unmuted, so if you want to ask away, while we get Salim's mic fixed.
Aside from the OpenAI's profit model, I was wondering, all these financial systems, we seem to be going through these boom and bust cycles, but the system does seem to be increasing in size, it is growing. But then the question is, how do we get everyone on board on a different sort of mechanism where the growth rate is less, but then we would be having less of the buzz. But and also crucially, is that even possible? Like, can we say for sure that this is not the efficient way to grow as a global? Maybe this of one vehicles is the most efficient way to grow as a system. Even from a no, go ahead.
Sorry, I think I didn't hear everything. I don't know if it was my connection or yours. Just a couple of thoughts on that, and then I think I know we need to go. And I feel free, if anybody needs to drop off, feel free to drop off. So first of all, the world is changing, right? From the perspective, like, these booms and busts are getting bigger and bigger, and I think that like we're getting to kind of a climactic thing, in my opinion, where there will be some type of a reset, and there have been many resets in the world, in the history of the world. One of the reasons that I started a crypto exchange, and I'm very excited about it, is that I do believe that, this idea of money being tied to the identity of, for the most part, a nation state is an outdated concept, right? And if you think about, let's take the US, and if let's say you had a New York coin and a New Jersey coin and a California coin, or even if you went into the state and you said you have a Rochester coin and a New York City coin, and like, what a schlep, right? Like, who wants to be going and paying 2% to, or even forget that, let's say a Manhattan coin and a Brooklyn coin. Like, everybody's like, okay, stop now, that's enough. Like, that's getting crazy, right? Who wants to go and, when you get out of the subway from Manhattan to Brooklyn, to go and change your New York dollars or your Manhattan dollars to Brooklyn dollars, right? And that's craziness, right? But that's exactly what we do when we get off the plane from one country to another, which is also, it's ridiculous, right? So I believe very strongly that the world needs a monetary system that is not based on the identity of nation states, but is based on the identity of humanity, right? And that's why I love Bitcoin and crypto, because it views the world as one from that perspective. It doesn't make a difference who you're from, where you're from, what color your skin is, whether you're a man or a woman, whatever it is. The system is open to you. So I think we will, history shows us we're going to be moving to that world. Whether it's crypto or not, I don't think it's gold, right? And I don't think there's any other alternative, really. And so I think the way to go to that system, if we can agree that that system is kind of where it makes sense to be, where there's much less friction that's, in our financial system, then there are two ways to get there from where we are right now. It's either through an orderly transition, but orderly transitions require those in power to choose that transition that divests themselves and their vested interests of that power, which history tells us is not very likely, right? Or you head there in a disorderly direction, where you have to have a severe crisis, and from that crisis comes victory for society to move forward. And unfortunately, I think we're in that second movie right now, where we are heading towards the crisis that seems to be continuing. So I think that's the one thing that I wanted to share. I forgot another part of your question, which I wanted to address. Let me just see, what would you say is missing from today's current spiritual systems? I think the big thing that's missing, Jess, is one word: unity, right? If you look at kind of all the spiritual systems everywhere, they often talk about the same thing when it comes to the core of what they believe in, right? The things that change are some of the social teachings that must change as time changes over, the course of years and centuries and millennia. But I think we will come to realize that there's something very, what's the word that I'm looking for this? the aspect of the unity of the human race is something that affects us all, right? I think in our own lives, disunity disturbs any human being, right? And I think at a spiritual level, the disunity that we have on a global level is disturbing our well-being globally. And so I think what's missing right now is that we're still trying to kind of push agendas without that sacrifices unity to try to be right. And I think that as long as we keep doing that, we're not going to kind of make progress. And I think the first thing we need to do is kind of say, okay, listen, let's first have unity, right? Let's put our differences aside, and then we can solve our problems. But our approach has been different. It says, let's solve our problems first, then we'll get unity. But I think it needs to be flipped on top of its head. I know we're way over time now, or 5 minutes over time, Andy. So I definitely don't want to steal anybody else's time further than what we have already done. So,
Fuzz. Just there we go. So again, time is a very relative concept, especially in Go. But I do, of course, appreciate your precision and care for everybody's time here, and I deeply appreciate you taking an hour out of your.
No pleasure. I do have a few more minutes, but I just didn't want to be disrespectful to anybody on the call. So if there are other questions, etc., happy to stay on. But if not, I also didn't want to take too much of everybody's time.
There's we have a culture in which it's perfectly acceptable to leave at the hour, and nobody holds you in any way accountable for it. But if you want to stay for the after party, then you know that that's where all the best dancing happens anyway. There's one thing that I would like to sort of just finish some of my thoughts here, just in terms of what really touched me about this article that you shared that we've been circling today. It's just, the notion of a commitment to justice and compassion for all, or honesty, trustworthy, generosity, justice, and consideration for others. These are directly lifted from the article itself. And I don't think that you need to agree with everything in there to recognize the deep humanity in these extraordinarily simple indications. And these indications are so simple and so powerful because they can be lenses through which we look at very technical economic questions, lenses through which we look at the kind of security that we provide and the products that we build for people, lenses through which we look at the exact mechanisms that we design which creates and distribute value in the world. And that, to me, goes to what Susan was saying about exchanges around values. Like, how do those two things get more and more integral and integrated with one another, so that value and values are not these worlds apart? Not a difficult concept, but
it's a very good point. Value and values, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know if that was a direct question to me, but yeah.
It brings me to one last thing, because I think what you were perhaps hovering around with Rich's question was that we need to, in some sense, keep growing the pie to satisfy the needs of more and more people brought up to a level of dignity and humanity, one might say. Humanity is absolutely wrong. Dignity.
Sorry, I did know you just jolted my memory, which is about growth, which is what I wanted to tell you. We're all aspiring for startups, countries, higher growth rates, etc. Right? And in nature, we have a term for excessive growth. It's called cancer, right? And which is not a good thing, right? And so I think, again, I think it's helpful to ask ourselves the question: why are we trying to grow? Right? Like, what is the purpose of that growth? Is it just to have a higher bank account so that we can feed our egos and we can say, or my country is the best country in the world, or like what is the end that we're aiming for, rather than just the means, right? Because growth in and of itself can be a good thing, it can be a very bad thing. Right? Well, what are we trying to achieve? And I think people have oftentimes lost the plot. They don't think about that. So they're oh, we're just going to grow, 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 grow. But why? What are you trying to do? Like when you're 80 years old and you're about to die, like what are you going to be proud of, right? So so I think we would do well to think about that, and also just think about what are we trying to aspire towards in our lives, right? And then keep asking that. And that kind of goes to Susan's question about assumptions. You know, how does assumptions change in an individual and groups across divergent perspectives? What is the mechanism of that change? I think there are many ways that happens. One is through education, right? There are, I think, enlightened individuals, human beings that are much more enlightened than most of us, that have a lot of kind of light to give to the world, whether that's through scientific discovery or spiritual insight, but then also through learning, trial and error, through crisis, through suffering. We also learn to question our assumptions, right, in our personal lives and the society at large. So yeah. Sorry, I'm not conversations as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Farzam, I wanted to share right before, so this Algovera AI, it's really beautiful. Basic TLDR is Algovera, the team, we've gotten to spend some good time with them in kernel, and how their AI tool, kind of like a ChatGPT type front end, at least, you ask a question to it, it can be trained on specific materials. So in this case, we were lucky to be able to train it on this kernel syllabus, which is the open source syllabus that we use to guide a lot of kernels, conversational spaces. I put a portion of the quote in the chat, starting from when courage and moderation are birthed in the heart, then the seed of modesty may take root in our being. Modesty, given time, may bloom into wisdom. With the exercise and application of wisdom comes the flourishing of justice. I thought that was really beautiful. But there was a portion like just before that. And it says, let's see. It talks about two things. It says, we can groom the force of attraction to cultivate moderation. We can groom the force of repulsion to cultivate courage. And I think like that really reminds me a lot of like what's being discussed here. These two things: cultivate moderation, cultivate courage. If you can in your own life, it's indicative of the application of wisdom, and it leads to the flourishing of justice. And it's like, it's really nice to be with somebody who can take that down to the level of like how a financial institution works and how a crypto exchange works, both being things that we need to know deeply to move with moderation and courage, right? So yeah, I guess I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Very beautiful. Thanks for sharing, Vivek. Like that, I really like that quote a lot.
It was written by the AI also.
It's awesome. It's awesome.
Faz, now it really is time to let you go. Thank you so very, very much for giving us so much of your time. I know that it is a world, and we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for all your time, and thanks for listening and being part of the conversation, and thanks for the invite, Andy. Really appreciate it. And all the best in all your individual endeavors and projects. I'm glad we had this opportunity for our paths to cross, hopefully again some other day.